Today on Market Journal, with harvest beginning, learn some ways to estimate your corn and soybean yields, and how scatting diseases in your field can help you prepare for next year. Plus, from nutrient management to soil sampling, we'll give you some tips to improve your soil fertility this fall. And a new film is offering a chilling look at the dangers of grain bin entrapment. Hear what inspired the filmmakers and how they hope their movie can help prevent more farming accidents. This week's Market Journal is a special Husker Harvest Days edition, and it starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. So the show looks a little different this week. We're out of the studio and in Grand Island for Husker Harvest Days. This marks the 42nd year for this event. Here you'll find about 600 exhibitors showcasing some of the latest in farming technology and machinery. Plus, you can hear from speakers and check out some cool field demonstrations. People come from all over for this show. This week, we're going to bring you some of the highlights from our 3 days here in Grand Island, and we're starting off by talking with Nebraska Extension's Rees about corn and soybean diseases and preparing for harvest. Pre-harvest diseases, something we mentioned a lot, still important to hammer that home though. So what are some of the top questions you've been getting from producers? And I guess keeping in mind, you've got your cornstalk example, I've got my cob, you've got some soybeans. What have people been saying to you?
Yeah, Troy, they're wondering what's going on in the fields we've got plants that are just, if I was to extend this whole plant, they're just out there and they're just dying in the fields. And we've got soybean plants in situations that are just dying in the fields as well. And so the questions are, what's going on there?
Regarding corn and soybean diseases, what can you tell us here?
So what I can tell you is that we've got a bunch of different types of stalk rot that are occurring in fields, and a lot of different reasons for that. It could be due to the ponding, compaction, it could be due to nitrogen loss in fields, it could be due to any number of reasons, disease issues, things like that. And so plants that are just dying early in fields, we're finding a lot of this where these stalks, if you were to just use a pinch test and try and push it, it gives very easily. And then if I was to open this stalk for you, you can see.
Yeah, it's brown all the way through there and rotted, yeah.
That's right. And so we have several different types of stalk rot diseases, anthracnose and bacterial stalk rot, Fusarium gibberella, that are all occurring right now out in our cornfields. So our recommendation to growers right now is just get out before harvest and either use the pinch test where you're pinching the stalk in between those nodes just to see if they give easily, get a percentage for your field. Gives you an idea if that field should be harvested earlier before it goes down in any windstorms and things.
Would you say because of the unusual season that we've had this year that diseases like stalk rot you're mentioning are more prevalent?
Yeah, the unusual weather, all the cool, wet weather that we've had has really increased our potential for diseases this year too. On the soybean side, plants that are dying in fields right now, if they have a rotted taproot like this, it's due to sudden death syndrome. So we're seeing a lot of that depending on susceptible varieties and history. And then there's two other diseases that is on this soybean stem. And one is you would see these rows of black dots, and that's due to pod and stem blight. Or these areas that have these black blotches on the stem, that's due to anthracnose. But if you remember last fall, we had some issues with seed quality and how sometimes those seeds were kind of shrunken or they were kind of moldy in appearance, chalky colored in appearance. that's this pod and stem blight that's kind of part of a complex that causes that. So maybe something to anticipate for this year too.
And it's also that time of year when we need to get those pre-harvest estimates in. So starting with corn, what do we need to know?
So when it comes to taking yield estimates for corn, it's about counting how many plants you have per acre. So we do it in basically 1/1000th of an acre, depending on the row spacing, how many plants you have with ears. And then you grab some of those ears and you're counting how many kernels long, how many rows around. And you can multiply these and you can show the equation on the screen.
And for estimating soybeans, what do we need to do when we get out into the field?
So estimating soybeans to me is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot more factors that go into that equation. But again, it comes down to what's your plant population and how many pods, how many seeds ultimately. And then it goes into seed size and an estimate on the seed size on that as well. And so we can also show that equation.
So it's growing above the ground is important, but the soil underneath it is crucial for a successful harvest too. Nebraska Extension Cropping Systems Educator Todd Whitney gives us the dirt on soil preps before harvest.
This time of year has to do with cover crops and whether to plant some cover crops behind the fall crops, as far as the timing, types of cover crops to grow, and along with that is soil testing in the fall. How do we help improve the health of the soil? What are some of the tests that could be used? And along with that too is timing of when should we stop irrigating, when do we start looking at the end of the season for the soybeans and the cornfields, and how do we get that health growing in the soil after we've had a fall harvest.
And let's talk about nutrient loss in soil for a second. Is there anything leading up to harvest that a producer can do to minimize that?
Well, one thing is generally our nutrients like nitrogen are ones that are leachable. They are water soluble and they follow the moisture. So when we put on excess moisture in the fall, sometimes it's rain, we can't helpful, but when we have excess moisture and it moves down, sometimes we're moving those nitrates down below the root zone. And so if we can try to help hold those nutrients there, that's where a cover crop can maybe help absorb some of those nutrients, hold on to it, and then maybe start decomposing in the spring and make it available for the next crop so it's less likely to keep leaching down. So our big concern is not over fertilizing, trying to match our yield to the amount of nutrients that we're putting on, or match the nutrient to the yield. And so we're trying the best we can at being good stewards, where we're not over applying on any of the inputs, but make enough of an input that we're not shorting the crop.
And when it comes to soil sampling, can you give us a quick recap on what we need to know as far as that is concerned?
Well, it's always good to follow a consistency. So if you have had a tendency of take your samples in the fall, continue to do that. I think that's a good tool to be able to move forward with. If you switch and say, well, I'm going to take some samples in the fall, and now we're going to compare those to samples that I used to do in the springtime, you may have a little bit of a learning curve, because when we have mineralization in the winter, you're going to have more of those nutrients available. So your spring testing will generally show higher values than what you will see in the fall. And so just keep that in mind and try to calibrate, so if you're doing it at a different time of year, that you're not overcompensating and saying, well, I looked at what my samples were saying in the fall, and now I'm going to fertilize similar to what I've always done when I've taken spring samples. You may be off a little bit. The other thing is we are seeing more soybean cyst nematode in our state than we used to, and so I think it's a good tool to go ahead and pull your soil sample for soybean cyst nematode. We have bags in our office that you can send in free of charge through the soybean checkoff. We have those tests that are available, so you can actually, it's similar to what you do for a regular soil test. Maybe you take some sample you're going to send into a lab for the soil sample, take another test at the same time of the same 6-inch or 8-inch depth, whichever you normally do, send that into the lab, and then we can have that analyzed at the university to see if you are having problems with that.
And after harvest, most producers are going to have some type of soil damage. So what are some ways you can get that soil healthy again?
Well, you know, some of the old school and still follows a little bit is if you've had a rut that is developed because of tillage, then we're probably going to have to use equipment to remediate it. Now, the best thing would be to use something that's going to have more of a shattering effect to the soil, like a chiseling would probably be better than trying to come in with a disc. Some other things we might think about is trying to plant some crops that would have a tendency of having a taproot that would maybe help loosen the soil. It's pretty difficult though when you have a rut to expect a root that's going to instantaneously make it better, and so it's just trying to add organic matter into that soil, help improve it so that overall we have a better holding capacity in the soil.
And then I see that you brought some samples for us. What would you like to tell us about what you have here?
Yeah. Well, if you do have a soil that has a good soil health to it, then we do have a test called Solvita. This has come available within the last few years. The Solvita is a type of a test that is testing for what we call a CO2 burst. And so when we have live organisms, they're taking in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide, CO2, and that's what this test is measuring. It has a paddle to it that starts off, the paddle usually is a blue color when it starts, and then over time it changes. So it's a 24-hour test. You put it in with your soil sample, and then this is meant to be an in-the-field sample, and then it will change a color, and then we use a chart, and this color chart will tell us how much activity we're having with the biologicals that are in the soil. And so we'd ideally like to have it around a 3.5 to 4. It can go up to a 6. If we get a 6, we have a lot of bacteria that are in the soil that are going to break down a lot of the organic matter, maybe too quickly in a sense. So we like to keep it kind of in a neutral range where we have good activity, but we're not breaking down that organic matter too quickly so we can actually build some of the health in the soil. So it is involved in the Haney test, but it hasn't been till the last couple years that we now have in the field that you can do, and in 24 hours you can have a pretty good assessment of what your field activity is. But keep in mind that if you have a soil that has not had a lot of cover crops or had a lot of build in it, that it's probably maybe not ready to have some of these tests done. This is more when you've been in the system for a while and you're wanting to see what the biology is and the improvement. It is a way then that we can use this to help us identify maybe how much fertilizer is going to be available for the next crop.
Hey everybody, this is Bill Todd coming to you straight from Husker Harvest Days, where we've had a lot of great tips on getting your crop out of the field and into the bin. However, according to a 2017 report from Purdue University, over 500 cases of grain engulfment have been reported with a 62% fatality rate over the last 50 years. Now, one exhibit here is looking to shed some light on the subject with a feature film called Silo.
I want to know why something so selfless and something so simple could go south so quick.
Code 3, 1024 to after grain disease. We have 2 individuals involved in a grain engulfment.
This week is National Farm Safety and Health Week. With that in mind, it's important to remember that grain entrapment is a risk that many producers face when working in grain bins. Silo is a feature-length film about a young man trapped in a grain bin, but more than that, it's a film about family, community, and a risk many producers take on a regular basis. This is a film that producer Sam Goldberg hopes can bring about not only professional awareness, but community awareness as well.
Because in small towns, most of the time it's a volunteer fire department, so the fire chief often knows the person who's entrapped, or the family, the farmer, etc. So our movie is about an ensemble group of people who have to unite to help save an 18-year-old boy's life. And at its core, that's what the movie's about. It's about community and we're distributing it in such a way that leverages community and taps into community across the country. So we're requesting and hoping that people will host a screening and be a community organizer and bring the movie to their town, and not just show the film, but host an event where maybe the volunteer fire department comes afterwards, does a grain rescue tube operation. They bring an expert in farm safety or an FFA teacher or the local farm bureau, the creditor, kind of bring everybody in the agricultural space together for an entertaining event that also can be educational by extension.
In just the last 2 months, 3 separate fatal grain entrapments occurred in Minnesota alone. If you're planning on working in a grain bin, it's always a good idea to have someone else around to get help if needed, or at the very least, let someone know where you are. According to the president of the Grain Handling Safety Coalition Board of Directors, Jeffrey Decker, when something like this happens, you're going to be working very hard against the clock.
The media, a lot of times you'll see on online stories or in the papers, man fell in a grain, or person fell in a grain bin. They didn't fall in the grain bin. They're going in there doing something they shouldn't be doing. Normally they go in, they leave the unload system running, they stand in the middle of the bin because a chunk of out-of-condition grain has blocked the grain from flowing. They stand right in the middle of that bin with a rod and they jab down through the grain to bust up that chunk. And when it works, and when they hit that chunk of grain, the grain literally grabs them and starts pulling them right down with it. So that's the most common way people get entrapped in or engulfed in the grain. So when you're dealing with this, response time, depending on how close the fire department is, how soon somebody finds you. If you're out there by yourself and you have no way to contact somebody, it can be hours. It may not be until you miss lunch or don't show up at home for dinner that hey, we better go look for him. So in that case, that's a really bad scenario. If somebody's there to shut the auger off and go get help, then a lot of rural fire departments, their response time still may be 20, 30 minutes. And, sometimes you get lucky and they're 5-10 minutes away, but and the other problem with the volunteer fire departments, and it's not a problem with them as such, but they may not have all the expertise and training they need to complete a successful silo rescue. So in that case, they may be calling the larger city that may be an hour, 2 hours, even 3 hours away to get a high angle rope rescue team or something like that coming. So now although they're there, they may not be able to facilitate the rescue until additional help arrives.
Originally from Manhattan, agriculture was very distant from everyday life for producer Sam Goldberg, who says working on a project like this over a 5-year period gave him a deeper appreciation for the hazards of agriculture and the men and women who pour their blood, sweat, and tears into what can often be a thankless job.
I think it's important that independent films like this are produced and pay honor to agriculture and to farmers and to fire rescue workers, all of whom kind of work their butts off at a very difficult, thankless job often to protect or feed the rest of us.
Now, if you're looking for any more information on this subject, you can visit our website. For now, we're going to send it back to the studio with Al Dutcher for your weekly forecast.
Well, thanks, Bill. That was great information. In terms of the forecast, as we go to the upper air charts, what we're dealing with is this upper air low that has moved out of the western United States. We talked about this last week, that it would slowly progress across the central United States, and that's exactly what it's done. In fact, it's actually slowed. So we're going to see a surface low developing in southwest Kansas. It's going to give a good fetch of moisture up to this region, and we expect some residual thunderstorm development in southeast Nebraska, but the main core will be to our north, and it will progress toward the southeast during the overnight hours, such that the trough will be over northern Wisconsin by tomorrow. We'll have a surface low over the Oklahoma Panhandle that will continue to keep the flow of moisture coming toward the north, and it looks like as that front blows through the overnight hours that most of the residual thunderstorm activity will reside in southeastern Nebraska. Then we kind of get a separation. This trough tries to break off from the northern jet flow. We still have one surface low that is going to eject out of that low in the southwest over west central Kansas, but it appears that the convergence of moisture will remain to our south as high pressure firmly locks in over the northern plains. And then by Tuesday, we see this low really cut off, and the main flow will be coming from the northwest. So we'll be looking for most of our systems to be entering in the Montana region, then driving toward the southeast, and we'll see that there is some convergence being shown on Tuesday with some energy ejecting out of this as these two systems work together, and that will progress to the east, and most of the cooler air will remain to our north as high pressure starts to funnel in on Wednesday. We're certainly going to be back toward normal to below normal temperatures, but the coldest will be to our north, and most of the precipitation on Wednesday will be more toward the east. On Thursday, this trough starts to dig in the west again, and we're going to repeat the cycle that we did this last week. Low pressures will start to line up at the surface as they eject out of this trough. The first initial wave of moisture starts to develop over the southern plains, and we'll start to lift toward the northeast, and by Friday, we We have a rather substantial trough that will carve out across the western United States, and we will eject the first main low pressure system to our area as we get into Friday with low pressure developing in the Panhandle. That will leave heavy precipitation in the southeast and numerous chances for heavy moisture across, unfortunately, the Dakotas and Montana as we get toward the later half of the week. More importantly, the models are increasingly looking at bringing that cold air in during this last few days of this month, and it looks like we have the setup for some potential freezing temperatures across at least the northern half of North Dakota and Montana. We'll really pay attention to this pattern, because if this digs a little bit farther toward the south and a little bit farther toward the east, we may see that cold air come down into the Dakotas, potentially even as far southward as the Nebraska border. As we look out into the future, the 8 to 14 day from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, doing a pretty good job of picking up this cold pocket, but I think they may need to expand this a little bit farther toward the east in terms of precipitation. With such a substantial trough coming out of the western U.S., we would expect to see some pretty significant moisture. And if you look at where the heaviest of the precipitation probabilities are, they are lying right in the areas that have seen such excessive flooding here over the last 3 to 4 weeks with a renewed heavy precipitation regime that has developed. Hopefully that we'll see some of this moisture expand towards southeast and south central Nebraska, where we have missed out on many of these precipitation events recently. And one thing that is for certain, we are not going to be dealing with 90-degree weather anymore. I think that hopefully we'll be dealing with maybe low 80s to up mid 80s, if indeed that does come to fruition. So overall, folks, it looks like we are going to be seeing a rather stormy pattern this weekend, and then much cooler conditions next week, more fall-like, but not unusually cold.
We're going to end this week's edition of Market Journal with something cattle and corn producers will find helpful. We all know that grazing leaves behind crop residue, but getting cattle to graze what's left over can be beneficial to each producer. Beef specialist and Associate Dean of Extension Rick Rasby joined me to explain more. The research that we're talking about has been going on for a number of years, talking about cattle grazing on the corn stalks and how that's not only beneficial to the cattle producer, but also the corn producer as well. So let's talk first about the cattle producer. Talk about some ways it's beneficial for them.
So this really been a really economical feed resource for the cattle. And we think about mostly cows that graze it, but we do have some folks that will put some wean calves or calves out there on that, but they'll do some kind of supplementation there. But from a cow standpoint, for a March calving cow, if you have them graze the husk and leaf, you don't have to do any supplementation because it'll maintain weight and body condition on those cows. Now for first calf heifers, you might gotta pay a little bit more attention to them because their nutrient requirements are a little bit higher. You might need to do a little bit of supplementation. But for the most part, you're just thinking about for mature cows, mineral supplementation is about the only thing that you need to do. Other than water, of course you need water out there, but mineral supplementation. So it really is a real good feed resource. If you have fall calving cows and you have cow-calf pairs going out there, then you got to think more about supplementation on them.
And they're selective grazers too. They're going to take that husk and the leaf first and leave everything else, right?
Exactly. That's the thing about cattle is that if there's any corn out there, and anymore there's not a lot of corn left out there. Those combines are more like vacuum sweepers anymore, but there's very little corn out there, so you're talking about husk and leaf, and that's exactly what they'll do. They'll take the corn first, followed by the husk and leaf, and finally the cob and the stalk. And if you take a look at the nutrient quality, corn is going to be the highest in nutrient quality out there, but followed by the husk and leaf, and finally the cob and the stalk. And they don't understand nutrient quality, the cattle don't, but those are the components that are most palatable, and those are the ones that they'll go after.
Yeah, they just know it tastes good.
They just know it, and they're palatable. They'll eat it. When you get down to the cob and the stalk, you don't want to graze that far anyway, but that's not very palatable, and so they'll selectively graze, and husk and leaf will be one of those in the hierarchy.
Okay, so we talked about the cow producer, now moving on to the corn producer, and this research shows that the grazing isn't going to have negative impacts on the yield for the next year. So is that just if you're a corn producer, then you're going to plant more corn, or if you decide to rotate over to soybeans, is one better than the other?
We saw it both ways. We saw there's no reduction in yield, especially as you move further east, there's the corn-soybean rotations, and so we took a look at that. In fact, there's no difference in corn on corn after grazing or corn-soybean rotations, so there's no negative effect on yield. The thing that we'd ask folks to do is that as you think about grazing corn residue, we'd ask them to use our Cornstalk Grazing calculator, because it basically, our data would be a function of us using that Cornstalk Grazing calculator, and that basically calculate the amount of husk and leaf and take half the husk and leaf, and that's when you'd move on to some other field.
And besides the corn grazing calculator, also the corn residue exchange. You want to mention that as well?
You bet. Jay Parson and his graduate students put together a nice, it's kind of like the hay exchange, and so this is a corn residue exchange, and so folks that have residue that they'd like to have graze can match up with folks that have cattle to graze, and vice versa. So as you move, you know, I grew up back out west, and there's not a field of corn that's not grazed. As you move further east, there's actually more corn acres, but there's fewer cows. And so there'll be some years that you can stand the freight to get cattle to a cheap feed resource. And so there is that exchange that is really being used quite extensively. First year not used very much, but boy, now it's being used quite a bit.
Any other research you guys are working on that the viewers would like to know about?
You know, sometimes folks say, well, you know, the research that you've done at Eastern Nebraska at Meade, or the research that maybe you've done at North Platte doesn't apply to my location. And you know, there's a lot of different locations and a lot of different soil types and those kinds of things across the state. And a couple years ago, we had a SARA project where we had residue grazing at 6 locations across the state. And we measured all the kinds of things that we measure on our big plots in eastern Nebraska at our research, and at North Platte at that research station. And we got the same data in 3 years that they got in 20 years. And so we're really comfortable with our grazing recommendations on corn residue.
Well, that's another Husker Harvest Days in the books. We hope that you enjoyed today's show, and the information you heard has you even more prepared for harvest. Remember, if you missed a story, you can download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. On the Market Journal website, you'll also find more information from the folks that we spoke with on today's show. We'll see you back in the studio next week. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.